Job, the man of integrity and God-fearing. The story of Job begins in a land called Uz, a place known for its beauty, prosperity, and tranquility. It was there that a man lived whose reputation resonated among the people as an example of integrity and devotion to God. Job was a unique man just in his actions, wise in his words and blameless before God and men. His life was a living testimony that it was possible to walk in the ways of the Lord, even surrounded by the temptations and challenges of the world. So let's go to the video, but first, just make sure you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, bringing history and biblical accounts that you haven't yet heard about. Job had impressive wealth for his time. He had thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys. To give you an idea, he was like a successful businessman, one of the richest men in his region, known and respected by everyone. However, his wealth was not his greatest glory. What really set Job apart was his unwavering faith in God. He was not only prosperous but also upright, just, and filled with the fear of the Lord. Job strove to live in a way that pleased God in everything he did. He was also a loving and devoted father. Job had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, who got along very well with each other. They often held banquets in their homes, taking turns organizing the feasts. It was a close-knit family full of joy, something rare and precious. Job, as a zealous father, was always attentive to the spiritual lives of his children. He knew that, in the midst of celebrations, there was a risk that their hearts would turn away from God. That is why, right after each banquet, Job would get up early, offer burnt offerings, and intercede for each of his children. Job would say to himself, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." With this concern, he regularly performed these sacrifices. This demonstrated not only his faith, but also his deep love for his family and his conviction that every aspect of their lives should be under God's care. It was as if Job were saying, "Lord, here are my children. I place them under your protection, for I know that only you are able to guard our hearts." This routine of prayer and sacrifice showed how much Job valued his relationship with God. He knew that everything he had, wealth, family, respect, came from the Lord, and he made a point of honoring him in everything. He did not allow comfort and prosperity to overshadow his gratitude. Instead, Job used his abundance as an opportunity to be even more faithful. So Job's life seemed perfect. He had a beautiful family, abundant wealth, and solid faith. He was an example to everyone around him. However, what Job did not know was that his faith and integrity were about to be tested in unimaginable ways. He would be pushed to the limit of his endurance, but all this would only show the world the power of true faith and unconditional love for God. This introduction to the story of Job makes us reflect. Do we maintain our faithfulness to God even in times of prosperity as he did? And when difficulties come, does our faith remain unshakable? The story of Job invites us to follow his journey to discover the answers to these questions. A conversation between God and Satan. The story of Job takes a surprising turn when we are transported to a heavenly scene, a place where momentous decisions about humanity are made. In this setting, the angels appear before God as loyal servants, bringing reports of their activities. Among them also appears Satan, the adversary, the one who roams the earth looking for opportunities to destroy and accuse. God, in his sovereignty, asks Satan, "Where do you come from?" And Satan answers with frightening coldness, "From going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it." It is an answer that reveals his purpose, to look for weaknesses, to spread doubts, to turn people's hearts away from God. Then God mentions Job. It is as if God is saying, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears me and turns away from evil." This divine statement about Job is powerful. God not only commends Job, but sets him up as an example to all creation, a living witness of how it is possible to be faithful, even in a corrupt world. But Satan, in his accusatory nature, issues a challenge. Does Job fear God for nothing? Is it not because you have surrounded him with protection, blessed the work of his hands, and filled his possessions with prosperity? But take away everything he has, and he will curse you to your face. Satan's provocation is clear. He questions the motivation for Job's faith, suggesting that Job is only faithful because he lives in comfort and abundance. It is a serious accusation, as if to say that Job's relationship with God was not genuine, but self-interested. God, however, knows Job's heart. He knows that his faith goes far beyond external circumstances. So, in an act that defies our comprehension, God allows Satan to test Job, but on one condition. All that he has is in your power, but do not touch his life. This permission from God is not a sign of weakness, but of trust. God knew that Job's faithfulness would be proof that true faith is not based on wealth, health, or comfort, but on a solid and unshakable relationship with the Creator. It was as if God were saying, "Do what you will with what he has, but his essence, his life, belongs to me." This heavenly conversation marks the beginning of one of the greatest challenges in Job's life. Satan, determined to prove his point, descends to earth with a plan to destroy everything Job had. But at the same time, God remained in control, knowing that even in suffering, his grace would be enough to sustain Job. This scene makes us reflect deeply on our own faith. Are we faithful to God only when everything is going well? Or does our trust in him remain even when we lose what we value most? The story of Job teaches us that true faith is forged in the fires of trials, and God always has a purpose, even when we cannot see it. From your opinion on this, make a comment of your interpretation. The first test: the loss of all possessions and children. The sun had barely reached the sky when an ordinary day in Job's life turned into a scene of unimaginable devastation. The man who had once been surrounded by countless riches and the joy of his children would now see his faith put to the brutal and sudden test. It all began with the hurried arrival of a messenger, panting and with a face pale with despair. He could barely find the breath to deliver the terrible news. "Job, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabeans attacked. They killed all the servants with the sword and took the animals. I alone escaped to tell you." Before Job could even process the impact of those words, another messenger appeared, running with panic written on his face. The fire of God fell from heaven and burned the sheep and the servants, consuming everything. I alone escaped to tell you. He had barely finished speaking when a third messenger appeared, bringing more devastating news. The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, attacked the camels, and killed the servants with the sword. I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Job's heart was already heavy, but the cruelest blow was yet to come. The fourth messenger arrived, with a broken look in his eyes and a trembling voice. Your sons and daughters were celebrating in the house of their eldest brother, when a powerful wind came from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it collapsed on them. They all died. I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Job's world collapsed in a single day. His wealth, built up over the years with work and dedication, was reduced to ashes and ruins. His children, the most precious treasure of his life, were swallowed up by death in a sudden and cruel way. Faced with such pain, Job stood up, tore his clothes in mourning, and shaved his head, an expression of deep despair and sadness. But instead of rebelling, he fell face down and worshipped God. Amidst the tears and devastation, his words echoed with unshakable faith. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Even surrounded by the rubble of everything he loved, Job did not blame God. His torn soul found strength in trusting in a greater purpose, even if incomprehensible at the time. His faith was not anchored in the blessings he had received, but in God himself. This was Job's first test, and his response has resonated through the ages as a testament to the true essence of faith. The second test. Job's health is affected. After enduring the loss of his possessions and his children with unwavering faith, Job now faces an even more cruel test. The scene changes, and once again we see a scene in heaven. Satan stands before God. The Lord, proud of Job's integrity, asks, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless, upright, one who fears God and shuns evil. Even after all he has suffered, he maintains his integrity." But Satan, crafty, replies, "Skin for skin. A man will give all he has in exchange for his life. Stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and you will see if he will not curse you to your face. The Lord, confident in Job's faithfulness, grants Satan permission to touch his health with one clear condition. Behold, he is in your power, but spare his life. Satan wastes no time. In one devastating blow, Job is struck down by a terrible disease. Painful, festering sores cover his body from head to toe. His skin breaks out in burning wounds, itching and burning relentlessly. The man who was once respected and admired is now unrecognizable, reduced to a shadow of his former self. Unable to find comfort in his own home, Job sits on a pile of ashes, a symbol of mourning and humiliation. With no other way to ease his pain, he picks up a shard of pottery and begins to scrape at his wounds, in a desperate attempt to find some relief from the unbearable suffering. The silence around Job is deafening. The once most prosperous man in the land now stands alone, covered in sores and ashes. The respect and admiration he once received have given way to looks of contempt and pity from those who saw him. His body was scarred by disease, but the real battlefield was his soul. Yet Job does not curse God. His physical suffering is overwhelming, but his faith remains, sustained by a deep trust that goes beyond human comprehension. What Satan failed to understand was that Job's faith was not anchored in his health, wealth, or comfort, but in the assurance of God's sovereignty and goodness. This second test revealed a powerful truth. The value of faith lies not in moments of prosperity, but in endurance in the face of the deepest pain. Job, covered in wounds and amid ashes, became a symbol of perseverance that transcends physical suffering and touches the heart of God himself. Job's wife questions her faith. Job's suffering was not just physical and material. He also faced the deepest emotional pain, the kind that comes from those we love most. After losing his possessions, his children, and being struck down by a terrible disease, Job was plunged into an abyss of grief. Sitting in ashes, his body covered in sores, scraping his wounds with a potsherd, he looked like a defeated man to the world. But within him still burned a flame of faith. His wife, who had also lost everything, her children, her security, and the comforts of life as they knew it, was consumed by despair. She saw the strong, upright man with whom she had built a family now reduced to a pitiful state. Her grief was different from Job's. It was a quiet grief mixed with disbelief and anger, an internal struggle against what seemed to be the injustice of fate. In a moment of pure despair and bitterness, she approached Job. Her words did not come from hatred, but from pain and an inability to understand the suffering that had befallen them. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. These harsh and bitter words echoed not as a direct affront to Job's faith, but as a cry of despair. She could not understand why such a righteous and faithful man should endure so much misery. Perhaps for her, death would be a relief in the face of so much suffering. But Job, even torn apart inside and out, responded with serenity and a wisdom that only true faith can offer. You speak like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not evil? Her words were not a cruel rebuke, but a firm reminder of the nature of life and the sovereignty of God. Job understood that true faith is not conditional, not dependent only on moments of prosperity and joy. It is a commitment that endures through the brightest days and the darkest nights. In that brief exchange, Job taught a lesson that has stood the test of time. True faith does not seek only rewards, but remains steadfast even when everything around it crumbles. He showed that while suffering can shake our hearts and our certainties, there is an inner strength that, if anchored in God, will not break. Job's response not only revealed his spiritual resilience, but also a deep love and patience for his wife. He did not condemn her for her bitter words, for he knew she was suffering too. Instead, he offered a truth that could sustain them, even in the darkest valley of grief. Job's friends arrive. As Job sat in ashes, his body covered with sores and his soul plunged into indescribable sadness, news of his tragedy spread quickly. 3 of his oldest and most respected friends heard of what had happened: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Wise men, known for their experience and thoughtful words, decided to gather together and travel to Uz to comfort and support Job in his suffering. The journey to Job was long and arduous, but nothing could prepare them for what they would see. When they saw Job from a distance, they could barely recognize him. The man who had once radiated health, wealth, and dignity was now disfigured by pain, his skin marred by open sores, his face aged with suffering, and his eyes hollow, lost in dark thoughts. Seeing their friend in such a state, a deep shock and sadness overcame them. In a gesture of mourning and solidarity, they tore their clothes, an ancient custom that symbolized the heartbreak of pain. Then they took handfuls of dust and threw them over their heads, symbolically sharing in the suffering that had befallen Job. Without saying a word, they approached him and sat down beside him on the dry, dusty ground. And there they remained, for 7 days and 7 nights in absolute silence. There was no verbal consolation, no motivational speeches, no attempts to explain the inexplicable, only silence. A heavy silence that said more than any words could express. This silence was not empty. It was a silence full of meaning, a testament to the depth of Job's pain and to his friends' respect for his suffering. They understood that in moments of extreme pain, no words can heal, only the presence of solidarity. For those 7 days, time seemed to stand still. The sound of the wind carrying the desert dust, the distant crackling of a fire, and the occasional sound of Job's heavy breathing were the only interruptions to the stillness. But even without words, there was a silent communication between them, the language of compassion, empathy, and true friendship. This scene, with its powerful simplicity, shows that sometimes the greatest comfort we can offer someone who is suffering is not in advice or explanations, but in the willingness to simply be present, sharing the weight of their pain, even if in silence. So, have you heard this story of Job? Let us know what you think in the comments, and tell us which part has surprised you the most so far. Job's lament. The weight of grief. After 7 days and 7 nights of deathly silence where the weight of grief hung in the air like a thick fog, Job finally broke the silence. His words did not come out softly or in a controlled manner, but rather like a dammed river that, when it finds a gap, overflows with uncontrollable force. It was the cry of a torn soul, crushed by a suffering that seemed to have no end. Sitting motionless in the ashes, his face streaked with dried tears and his skin bruised by physical suffering, Job raised his voice not to accuse but to vent. He did not curse God but lamented the day of his birth. His words echoed with a weight that surpassed the physical pain, revealing the torment of a soul that found no solace. May the day perish when I was born, and the night in which it was, said a child is conceived. May that day turn into darkness that God above does not care about him, nor does light shine upon him. Job spiraled into a deep self-doubt, wishing he had never existed. He questioned the purpose of life when it was filled with suffering and despair. In his anguish, he wondered why light is given to the wretched and life to the bitter in spirit, who long for death but it does not come. Every word Job spoke was a reflection of his pain, an echo of his despair. He was not seeking answers at that moment. He simply needed to free himself from the weight that was crushing his soul. Job's lament was not just an expression of suffering, but an attempt to find meaning in the midst of chaos, a desperate search for understanding. Yet even in the midst of this whirlwind of pain, there was something remarkable. Job still addressed his words to God, even if in the form of lament. This reveals that, despite everything, his connection with the Creator had not been severed. He may have been full of doubts and anguish, but he was not indifferent. His pain was a dialogue, a cry that, although painful, still held a thread of hope. Job's lament is a raw portrait of human vulnerability in the face of suffering. It is the voice of all those who at some point in their lives felt crushed by the weight of pain and sought, through tears, a meaning to move forward. So, are you enjoying the video? Leave a comment. Tell us what you learned from this story and how it can help us in our lives. Enjoy and leave your like. Debates with friends. Reflections on justice and suffering. After Job's deep lament, the silence was broken not only by his words of pain, but also by the voices of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. What began as an attempt at consolation soon turned into long and intense debates about the nature of human suffering and the justice of God. Eliphaz was the first to speak. In a tone of one who relied on experience and tradition, he suggested that Job's suffering could not be random. According to his logic, God is just, and if Job was going through such affliction, he must have committed some hidden sin. He said, "Remember, Job, does the innocent perish? Where are the upright destroyed? I have seen that those who plow evil and sow trouble reap the same." Job, wounded by both his wounds and his friends' words, responded firmly. Defending his integrity, he declared that he had always lived righteously, honoring God and caring for those in need. In his response, Job not only defended himself, but also posed a question that would echo through time. Why do the wicked live, grow, and grow strong? If the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper, where is justice? Bildad and Zophar followed, the same line of reasoning as Eliphaz, each adding their own interpretations. Bildad appealed to the tradition of the ancients, saying that wisdom was in the teachings of their ancestors, and that God would never pervert justice. Zophar, more severe, even suggested that Job's punishment was even less than he deserved, a painful accusation for someone already crushed by suffering. But Job did not remain silent. His answers were not just a personal defense, but a cry for understanding. He did not deny God's justice, but questioned the simplicity of his friends' explanations. He challenged the idea that suffering was always a direct result of sin, arguing that life is more complex than this limited view allows us to see. The dialogue between Job and his friends reveals a clash between tradition and personal experience, between theory and the reality of suffering. Job did not seek only to justify himself, he wanted to understand. His questions were a reflection of human pain in the face of the inexplicable. Why do the righteous suffer? Why does evil sometimes prosper? These debates show that in the midst of pain, there are not always easy answers. They invite us to reflect on how we deal with the suffering of others. Do we offer genuine comfort or make hasty judgments? Job, in his pain, did not find answers in his friends, but his questions paved the way for a much greater revelation that was Job's patience and perseverance. Despite the relentless accusations of his friends and the lack of clear answers to his agonizing questions, Job remained steadfast in his search for understanding. He did not allow himself to be consumed by bitterness, nor did he allow despair to completely destroy his faith. His heart, though broken, remained focused on God. Job was surrounded by voices echoing judgments and simplistic explanations of his suffering. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar insisted that he must have committed some hidden sin, yet Job knew his integrity. He did not consider himself perfect, but he was fully aware of his righteous life and the constant fear he had for God. This made his pain all the more acute, for he could not understand why such a calamity had befallen him. Yet Job did not give up questioning. His words were a mixture of outcry and resistance, of pain and hope. He said, "Even if he slays me, I will trust in him. I will plead my case before him, and in the end, I will be vindicated." This statement reveals the essence of Job's patience. It was not a resigned passivity, but an active perseverance. Job struggled to understand, debated with his friends, and even challenged God's silence, but he never abandoned his faith. He did not deny his pain, but neither did he deny God's presence in his life. Job's suffering did not erase his hope. In the midst of chaos, he uttered one of the most powerful declarations of human faith. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at last he will stand upon the earth, and after my body is destroyed, I will see God with my own eyes." These words came not in a moment of comfort, but in the midst of the most extreme adversity. Job had no visible guarantees, no sign of imminent relief. Yet he persevered, clinging to the certainty that God was beyond his suffering, that there was a greater purpose that he did not yet understand. Job's patience was not a blind acceptance of pain, but a faith that endured even without answers. He teaches us that perseverance does not mean not feeling pain, but continuing to trust, even when the sky seems silent. His story is a testament to the strength that lies in unwavering faith, even in the darkest storms. Okay, we're almost at the end of the video, but before we do, I noticed that you haven't liked this video yet. This is very important for YouTube to continue promoting our videos to you, so leave a like now, it's free, okay? Let's continue. Elihu's intervention. A new point of view. After long and exhausting debates between Job and his three friends, a new character decides to break the silence. His name is Elihu, a young man who was present the entire time, listening attentively to every word spoken by Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Unlike them, Elihu waited patiently because he respected the age and experience of these older men. But now, realizing that the arguments presented did not bring any real solution, he feels he needs to speak. Elihu presents himself as a young man driven by the Spirit of God to bring a new point of view. He addresses Job and his friends firmly, but without the same accusatory tone as the others. He shows indignation because he realizes that Job's friends failed to prove him wrong, and at the same time, Job was so focused on his own righteousness that he had not fully considered divine sovereignty. Elihu begins his speech by emphasizing that God is greater than man, and that his ways are beyond our comprehension. He reminds Job that suffering is not necessarily a punishment for past sins, as Job's other friends insisted. Instead, Elihu suggests that suffering can have a greater purpose, serving as a form of discipline and spiritual growth. He argues that God speaks to men in many ways, through dreams, visions, and even pain, to turn them away from evil and bring them back to the right path. With words full of wisdom, Elihu extols the greatness of God. He describes nature and the universe as witnesses to God's power, showing that God governs all things with justice and perfection. Unlike Job's other friends who only condemned him, Elihu invites Job to reflect and humbly seek God, recognizing that the Creator acts with a purpose, even when we do not understand his ways. Elihu is a turning point in the story. He paves the way for the next and most important part of the narrative, God's own response. His intervention teaches that in the midst of pain, we should not only question, but also listen and learn. God is just, and his love often manifests itself in ways we don't immediately understand. God speaks to Job in the midst of the storm. Job had been through unimaginable suffering. He had lost his possessions, his children, and his health. He cried out, questioned, and debated with his friends, and for a long time it seemed that God was silent. But now, something great happens. Suddenly, the wind begins to blow fiercely, the clouds close in, and a thunderous clap tears through the heavens. A storm gathers on the horizon, and in the midst of it, a voice echoes, powerful and majestic. God speaks, but he does not answer Job in the way he expected. He does not explain the suffering or reveal the details of the heavenly dialogue that took place between himself and Satan. Instead, God asks questions that reveal his infinite wisdom and power. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Job 38:4. Job listens attentively. Each word of God leads him to reflect on his own limitations. The Lord continues to describe the grandeur of creation. He speaks of the sea, which he has bounded with his hands, of the stars, which shine at his command, of the wild animals, which live and hunt according to his will. God challenges Job to consider whether he has the power to command these things. Can you call forth the lightnings that they may say to you, "Here we are"? Job 38:35. God continues to question him. Can he sustain the constellations in the sky? Can he feed the young lions and ravens? Can he control the seasons or give the horse strength to run swiftly? Each question is like a blow to his limited understanding. God is showing Job that the world is too vast and complex for one man to fully comprehend. The storm rages around Job, but within him, an even greater storm is dissipating. For the first time, he begins to see the bigger picture. He realizes that his pain, however deep, is within a universe created and governed by a sovereign God. Job, who once questioned so boldly, now shrinks before divine greatness. He realizes that his wisdom is insignificant in the face of God's infinite knowledge. God's answer is not a punishment. It is an invitation for Job to trust, to recognize that even without understanding, he can rest in the fact that God governs all things with purpose and justice. God's voice resounds once again, but now, Job no longer feels the need to question. He finally understands. God is greater than all his doubts. And so, you already knew this story of the prophet Job. Leave a comment to find out how far your faith will go. Take advantage of the fact that you've come this far, and leave your God speaks to Job in the midst of the storm. Job had been through unimaginable suffering. He had lost his possessions, his children, and his health. He cried out, questioned, and debated with his friends, and for a long time it seemed that God was silent. But now something great happens. Suddenly the wind begins to blow fiercely, the clouds close in, and a thunderous clap tears through the heavens. A storm gathers on the horizon, and in the midst of it a voice echoes, powerful and majestic. God speaks, but he does not answer Job in the way he expected. He does not explain the suffering or reveal the details of the heavenly dialogue that took place between himself and Satan. Instead, God asks questions that reveal his infinite wisdom and power. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Job 38:4. Job listens attentively. Each word of God leads him to reflect on his own limitations. The Lord continues to describe the grandeur of creation. He speaks of the sea, which he has bounded with his hands, of the stars, which shine at his command, of the wild animals, which live and hunt according to his will. God challenges Job to consider whether he has the power to command these things. Can you call forth the lightnings, that they may say to you, "Here we are"? But Job 38:35. God continues to question him. Can he sustain the constellations in the sky? Can he feed the young lions and ravens? Can he control the seasons or give the horse strength to run swiftly? Each question is like a blow to his limited understanding. God is showing Job that the world is too vast and complex for one man to fully comprehend. The storm rages around Job, but within him, an even greater storm is dissipating. For the first time, he begins to see the bigger picture. He realizes that his pain, however deep, is within a universe created and governed by a sovereign God. Job, who once questioned so boldly, now shrinks before divine greatness. He realizes that his wisdom is insignificant in the face of God's infinite knowledge. God's answer is not a punishment. It is an invitation for Job to trust, to recognize that even without understanding, he can rest in the fact that God governs all things with purpose and justice. God's voice resounds once again, but now Job no longer feels the need to question. He finally understands God is greater than all his doubts. And so, you already knew this story of the prophet Job. Leave a comment to find out how far your faith will go. Take advantage of the fact that you've come this far, and leave your like. Job's restoration. Double blessings. After all the suffering and trials Job has endured, the time for restoration arrives. God, in his infinite mercy and justice, not only restores to Job everything he had lost, but also grants him double the blessings. The days of anguish turn into times of abundance. His flocks, once decimated, grow in extraordinary ways. Now he has twice as many sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys. What was once a cause for pain and lamentation becomes a living testimony of God's restorative power. Poverty is replaced by prosperity, and pain by joy. But the blessing is not limited to material goods. God gives Job new children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, just as before. And these daughters are described as the most beautiful in all the land, receiving names that reflect the new phase of peace and happiness in their father's life. Unlike the customs of the time, Job, in a gesture of great generosity and justice, granted them an inheritance along with his brothers, demonstrating his love and respect for them. Job lived for many years after his restoration. He saw his children and grandchildren grow up, witnessing future generations enjoying God's grace. His life was long and full, filled with peace and fulfillment. Job's story ends with a powerful testimony. God is faithful. Even when we do not understand the reasons for adversity, He has a greater plan. Job's faithfulness was tested, and his perseverance was rewarded. His legacy spans the centuries as a living example of unwavering faith and hope in divine sovereignty. Job's legacy, an example of unwavering faith. Job's story does not end with his material and family restoration. His true legacy goes far beyond the wealth he regained or the extra years God granted him. He became a timeless symbol of patience, perseverance, and unwavering faith. Job's name echoes through the centuries as a living testament that, even in the worst adversities, it is possible to remain faithful to God. His suffering, his questions, his doubts, and his final repentance show us that faith is not the absence of questions, but trusting in God even when the answers are not clear. Job teaches us that although we may go through moments of inexplicable pain, God never abandons us. He is always present, even in the silence, even in the storm, waiting for the right moment to reveal Himself. His legacy also reminds us that divine justice does not always manifest immediately, but in due time, God honors those who remain steadfast. His descendants, who grew up under His guidance, certainly heard His story and learned to trust in God, regardless of the circumstances. And this same story continues to be told to this day, inspiring generations to never give up on their faith, because God has a greater plan that we cannot see. The book of Job ends with a message of hope and redemption. No matter how invincible suffering may seem, it does not define our journey. True victory lies in unshakable trust in the Creator, who knows all things and is in control of everything. Job's legacy is a powerful reminder that true faith remains firm, regardless of trials. Thank you for watching this far. Don't forget to subscribe and like to continue receiving the next videos, and the second part and continuation of this story is worth it. See you next time.